My guest today is Dave Andrews, President and Chief Executive Officer of the American Hockey League. Dave is a native of Nova Scotia, where he was an all-star goaltender in university. He became the Hockey Development Coordinator for the province of British Columbia and served for a 10-year term on the Canadian Amateur Hockey Association's Development Council. He joined the Edmonton Oilers as a director of the AHL American Hockey League operation for 7 years and built the Cape Breton Oiler franchise into one of the most successful entities in professional sport. In 1990, he received the James C. Henry Award as the AHL's utmost outstanding executive. In July of 1994, Mr. Andrews assumed his responsibilities as President and Chief Executive Officer of the American Hockey League. Under his direction, the American Hockey League has become the sole primary development league for all of the 30 NHL hockey organizations. In 2001, he led one of the most expansive expansions ever in pro sports. The league's footprint has grown dramatically during his tenure, which include places such as Chicago, Toronto, Cleveland, Milwaukee, Charlotte, Austin, and Oklahoma City. League attendance has climbed dramatically under your leadership, doubling from almost 2.9 million prior to 1994 up to 6.2 million in 2001. In recognition of these many accomplishments, you've been named the 2010 recipient of the prestigious Lester Patrick Trophy, presented annually for contributions to hockey in the United States of America. You've also been honored with the induction in the British Columbia Hockey Hall of Fame in 2005, and then in 2006 to the Nova Scotia Sports Hall of Fame. Welcome to our program, David.
Thank you.
With your many successes and many challenges in professional sports, I'd like to get an idea from you in terms of what kind of preparation would you do for either a minor set of negotiations or indeed a major set of negotiations?
Well, again, I think it probably depends on the negotiation, and almost everything that we do on a daily basis, I think, is a negotiation, whether it's internal or external with external stakeholders. But certainly with any significant negotiation, or perhaps any negotiation, preparation is an awfully big part of it. I think one needs to know going into a negotiation what your objectives are and what you anticipate the needs of the other party are going to be. And while you can't begin to play it all out, you can certainly be as well prepared as you can for what you think the position of the other side will be, and most importantly, whether you are prepared to represent your stakeholders in that negotiation, knowing that you have A, their support, and B, that you are seeking the things that they would like you to seek as their representatives. So I think preparation is really important.
What kind of workload would you have to conduct in terms of understanding the needs and aspirations of your stakeholders? Could you give us some examples of that?
Yeah, I think there are different sorts of initiatives that require different levels of preparation and different levels of stakeholder involvement. And I would say, and when I say, in this case, stakeholders, probably referring to the owners in our league. When I first began as president back in 1994, I would say my involvement with my inclusion of stakeholders in virtually every decision was probably over the top. Within a year or so, the stakeholders themselves began to say, look, you're doing a really good job. You don't need to spend this time consulting with us. We need you to lead, not to follow, and you have our confidence. And so as time goes along and you gain trust from those stakeholders and you gain a better understanding of what they will want in a negotiation.
That's a very interesting insight. You're starting off early in a particular position. You've got to gain that trust and the confidence. So you may, in fact, be a little bit over the top in terms of the consultations as opposed to, say, 15 years later.
Absolutely. It's much different for me now than it was 20 years ago, and it was much different 3 years after I started than it was when I started. Now I have to remind myself that I don't perhaps know everything and that I still need to check in with the stakeholders. But it depends, again, on the sort of negotiation we're going into. I think as an example, going into a collective bargaining negotiation, which we are going into probably in mid-January this year, That requires a fair amount of face-to-face stakeholder discussion. So we'll have a workshop with our full board. I have a meeting upcoming with National Hockey League general managers, who are another group of stakeholders who have an interest in our collective bargaining agreement, because the people we're negotiating for are actually their employees, and we're negotiating things that would affect player development in the American Hockey League. So we need to know what the National Hockey League general managers would like to see in a new agreement. We need to know what our owners would like to see in a new agreement. We need to think through strategically how a new agreement might impact various elements of our business beyond just the player relationship. So a lot of folks get involved, and then we would have a negotiating committee. We would have probably a committee to help us put together our negotiating wish list, if you will. So there'll be a lot of stakeholder engagement there. There are other initiatives that I would take on, for example, negotiating a new officiating agreement with the National Hockey League, which is coming up as well, where I probably won't engage the stakeholders at all. I know what our objectives will be. I know what the NHL position is likely to be, and we will enter into that negotiation without a whole lot of preparation other than my own, sitting down and saying, what do I hope to achieve here, and what are some of the challenges we're likely to face.
With all those multi-parties that you would have to deal with, how do you keep all of those balls in the air at once?
Well, it's probably a learned skill to a certain extent, and I think as we discussed a few minutes ago, a lot of it is if you build a trust level with stakeholders, it's fairly easy to work with them if they believe that you're acting in their best interest and they believe that you're providing good leadership. I've been able over the years to build that kind of relationship with the NHL teams, who are often on the other side of negotiations with our owners, and perhaps a lot of what I do is actually mediating rather than negotiating to help our teams and National League teams arrive at agreements. I built a certain trust level there, and it makes it a great deal easier, because you're right, the more stakeholders you have, the less opportunity you have to actually have direct contact regularly, or you would never get anything done because there are just too many people to have to consult.
Share with us, if you will, on the trust factor. What are some of the do's and don'ts, if you will, in trying to develop trust with people that you're going to be working with, not for a year, but for many years? What are some of those
I think
tips?
transparency.
Transparency?
I think honesty. And if there were a catchphrase I would use, it would be deliver on the promise. Whatever it is that you promise, you need to deliver. And if you can repeatedly deliver on what you promise you'll deliver in exchange for whatever they've given you, the next time you go to negotiate, there's a trust level that if you're promising something, that it's going to happen. And labor negotiations, I think, are a good example of that. I think our players over the years have developed a trust that if I say we really need this concession from our players in order to grow our business, in order to be successful, and down the road we will make it up to you. Well, we've done that. So I think even with our employees, when we hire people, we talk a lot as a group about whatever the promise is that you have to your stakeholders, to the people that you work with on a daily basis, whatever the promise is to yourself, whatever the promise is to your family, you got to deliver on if you deliver on the promise, you build trust. If I look back over the years at how I've managed to get to a position where a lot of these negotiations are easier than they will be for my successor, simply because I have a trust level built up interpersonally.
Trust, as you know, is a pretty solid foundation for relationships. Anything come to mind in terms of the many years that you spent in the hockey world in terms of developing those relationships? Are there some do's and don'ts? How would you approach that?
That's a really good question. I'm not, I don't believe myself to be very good on the cocktail circuit, and simply attempting to network is not something I've ever been very good at. For me, I think building relationships has been about being genuine, being yourself, being open and being friendly, and attempting to listen to other people. I think that's a big part of establishing a relationship. I think if people, anyone you're dealing with believes that you're superficially dealing with them and not really interested in them, it's difficult to build a relationship, or for you to believe you have a relationship with someone who's not really paying attention.
Tell us about the Dave Andrews communication style. Do you do the letters? Do you do the email? Do you do a combination? Do you do the telephone? How's your style in terms of communicating with others in fields of different negotiations?
I do way more emailing than I should, and I suggest to my staff that they do No emailing internally. If people are in the same building, leave your office, walk down the hall, and have a conversation. In any sort of negotiation, I think the more face time that you get, the better. I believe it's more difficult to, it's really dangerous to negotiate through email, in my opinion, because it's difficult to really understand the context of what's being said, and it depends where you are in a negotiation. If you're back and forth on point 27, that's different than setting the tone of a negotiation or being at an early stage or being at a closing stage. But I think for me, it depends a little bit how a negotiation is going. Face-to-face is an important part of the early stages. I think a fair amount of telephone conversation can be helpful informally, trying to move the process along. Anytime you get to closure on a point, you get to a stage where you want to get that written down and documented and maybe not signed off on, but at least understood by both sides that this is where we are. I find the only time that I will really respond in a very formal way is if things aren't going very well. And there are.
And what would that mean? What would you do?
Well, I think there are often points at which you will face someone who has overplayed their hand or is being deceptive. And particularly if your counterpart is being deceptive, I find a very good technique is to formalize that deception and say, did I understand you correctly that this is what will happen if? Because I believe that's what you said. And putting that kind of position in writing back to the person who floated the deception will very often back them off of the point, particularly if that happens to get copied to other stakeholders. So there are points that I would say anytime a formal written back and forth occurs in a negotiation that I'm involved with, the person on the other side knows that we may have hit a line that shouldn't be crossed.
Now, would that happen often in your dealings with the various stakeholders that the president and CEO of the American Hockey League Association has to deal with?
I would say not very often. I would say the most occurrences where we begin to really get into formalized letter writing, you're very close to closing the deal.
So we talked about your communication styles. Let's come back to your role as president and CEO and your relationship with the owners. Where do you get your mandate from? Because there is a relationship that the owners have with the NHL and the GMs in the NHL, but I guess I'm a little bit confused in terms of where you get your mandate.
Well, the formal mandate comes from our governing documents, which is, we have an organization with 30 votes, one team, one vote, one owner, one vote. And generally our governing procedures are 3/4 of that group is required to make a policy decision. So the mandate, the responsibilities and authority, I suppose, of the president and CEO are spelled out in the Constitution. Having said that, that's really, formally where you get your mandate, but you truly get the mandate from having consensus from your group on strategic direction. And one of the things that is a strength of mine is strategic planning. And from the very beginning, even before I took over as president of the league, in my interview for the position, I basically crafted a strategic plan for the league and said, if I'm selected for this position, this will be what I will present to the board for support for a strategic direction for the league for the next 4 to 5 years.
Well, tell us about that. What would you have, without giving us everything, but what would you have covered, for instance, in your strategic plan?
Well, at that time, our league was made up of 14 cities that had probably, at least half of them had a questionable shelf life, just based on the size of the market, on the costs of the business at the time, on the strength or lack of strength of ownership of our teams financially, the depth that we had financially, the competitive framework we were in with, at that time back in the early 90s, with the International Hockey League, who were a competitor of ours and who were certainly, in the eyes of most, were winning that battle in terms of gaining better markets and attracting better ownership and beginning to attract NHL teams to put their players in the other league. Essentially, it was like a SWOT analysis, I guess. You looked at the strengths and weaknesses of the league at the time and opportunities and threats for the future and laid out a roadmap to attack those. And, I would say within probably 18 months, we had probably gone down the first 4 years of that plan. We had expanded the league into new markets. We had attracted new ownership. We had established rules within the league that would define us as a league that was dedicated to player development as opposed to simply being a a minor league. We were going to be a league that developed players for NHL teams. And we built a business model where each of our teams had a specific contractual relationship for player development with NHL teams. That all happened very early because we knew there was a need for that for the NHL, and we knew that it would help us to control our costs to have NHL contracted players. So back to the question, I think your mandate comes from selling your vision to your stakeholders. And if the stakeholders buy into your vision informally or formally, there's your mandate. They've been asking, you've provided them leadership, they've agreed to the direction of the leadership, and now it's yours to take on. And in an anecdote for you, my first legal counsel was a gentleman named Matt Kilpatrick, who passed away many years ago now, a Yale law graduate, one of the founders of Silly Putty, by the way, which kids now probably don't know about, but it was an interesting thing, but a very successful businessman in his own right, and had been the league counsel for many years. And I can remember sitting at a board meeting in my second year on the job, and I threw out kind of an open-ended question for direction to the group. So there's probably 50 board members in the room. There's more than one per team. There's one vote, but there's more than one person at the table. And he sat next to me as our counsel, and he gave me a pretty swift kick in the ankle under the table. And I looked at him, and he leaned over and he said, "Don't ever do that again." And I said, "Well, why? What do you mean?" He said, "They're paying you to lead. They're not paying you to ask them what direction to go in." And I never forgot it. You know, it's not that you shouldn't seek opinion and you shouldn't seek support and seek ideas and have open discussion, but you know, don't make it appear as though you're not knowing what the map is and where you want to go. And I think that was really solid advice. And he said, you know, you shouldn't do that, and you don't need to do it because you've got a year and a half or 2 years of solid leadership. They trust you. Don't shake their trust by appearing not to know what you're doing.
Tell us, from a hockey perspective, it was quite a dramatic change, though, when you came to the AHL in making it a league which player development. Because I don't think it was perceived that way beforehand. It was where hockey players went, either after their NHL career, or they may come up, but it was just a franchise for professional sports. Am I right in that assessment?
Yes, and the business model, which we now have, is basically our player costs and coaching costs. All of our hockey professionals, the trainers, et cetera, are pretty much 50-50, not even that. They're probably 2/3 paid by the NHL clubs and 1/3 by the American League clubs. If our clubs had to sustain the entire cost of our player payroll and so forth, the business wouldn't be viable. So building this relationship with NHL teams where our league was seen to be providing a service to them, where the highest priority for us from a league point of view and a competitive point of view was to provide an environment where players who were drafted in the top 4 or 5 rounds of the draft would have a place to play and bridge between college hockey, junior hockey, and the National Hockey League, that's what we would be, gave value to our business for the National Hockey League. And we had to sell them on the importance of investing in our league. And as time has gone on, I mean, over the last 20 years, and certainly ever since there's been a salary cap in the National Hockey League, the AHL has become a place that NHL teams spend more and more money and put more and more emphasis because they need to develop players in order to be able to be competitive in the NHL with us in a salary capped environment. There's no question. I mean, we are so much more important to them than we were. I don't need to convince general managers anymore that they should be paying attention to the American League and to their teams. They pay more attention than you can imagine.
Could you give us some examples?
Well, I think if you just look at the structure of most NHL teams now, you'll see 2 or 3 guys that are at a very high end salary-wise, and you'll see entry-level players who have come through the American Hockey League, who are filling spots and growing within an organization, and there's only so much money to spend. And as those top guys begin to cost more money, the importance is that you can have high caliber players to surround them that you can afford. Teams just can't afford now to go out to the free agent market and sign players to come in and be the supporting cast for the superstars. So regardless of which team you pick, if you look at the top 2 or 3 guys, and then you go a little deeper, you'll usually find about 15 players on every team that will have, if it's Toronto, they will have come through the Marlies, or if it's Providence, they will have Boston, come through the Providence Bruins. And you'd be surprised at how many of those, very top players spent time in the American League. But beyond those top guys like Bergeron and Tuukka Rask and Zdeno Chara in Boston, all played in the American League. So their star group basically all played in the American League. But then you get below that into the second, third line and the third, fourth, fifth, sixth defenseman, and virtually every goalie in the league, because they need development time, have all played in our league. And at this point, we're at, I think at the end of last year, 88% of the players in the National Hockey League had spent time in the AHL. And during any given year, more than half of our players will play in both leagues. So it's really crucial for it. You can just imagine, for a team to be successful, that they've got a really good system in the AHL of player development. And so that element of my job, which in the early, probably the first 10 years, there was a lot of positioning our league with the NHL and positioning our league with the general managers, that you really do need to invest with us. That is really not nearly as big a piece of my work pie as it used to be.
Let's come back to the mandate. You mentioned in a positive way in terms of what legal counsel had told you. We're hiring you to lead. But you're not denying the fact that stakeholder involvement, stakeholder relationships, understanding where the stakeholders are an important aspect of developing your plan.
Yep.
For the purposes of leading. Am I correct in that?
Absolutely correct. And we have an executive committee of, I think there's probably 11 owners on that executive committee that I keep pretty close to me on every decision. And the hotter the issue, the more I share the potential success or failure. So in any kind of really hot button issue, that group will be very involved. And at the same time, you need to make sure that the rest of your immediate stakeholders, the ownership group, are involved as well, because if they're not in the inner circle, you can very quickly have a group of people in behind that executive committee who feel as though they haven't been part of the process and can become a problem for you. And I think so communication and understanding where opposition might come from on any particular initiative you're putting forward is important. Generally, I'll have my executive committee fully on side with any direction we're going in. I don't worry very much about them because they're quite engaged, but I keep in the back of my mind, where is the opposition likely to come from within our stakeholder, our ownership group, on any particular issue, and get on the phone and have conversations and make sure they understand the strategy. And I think generally, there are operational issues and there are strategic issues, or strategic initiatives. And a lot of operational decisions will be challenged by folks who perhaps don't understand what the strategy is behind it. And as a leader, if you begin to think that everyone understands the strategy or should understand the strategy when you haven't explained it to them, you're looking for trouble. And so I try to be careful about looking for hot spots and making the call and say, I know you're probably not going to like this thing that's coming down in the next few days, but here's why, just so you understand. Here's the thinking behind it and why we're doing it. And that generally keeps some of the fires from getting too hot.